The Cook's Poisoned Broth, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins in a warm kitchen, where the cook's broth was famous throughout the village, rich, comforting, and served with pride at every gathering. No one ever questioned the recipe, and certainly no one questioned the cook who prepared it. But one evening, after a simple supper shared among friends, someone falls suddenly ill, and suspicion begins to simmer beneath the surface. The villagers whisper of accidents and spoiled ingredients, yet Miss Marple notices the subtle details others overlook, the careful timing of the meal, the guests invited to the table, and the one person who knew exactly what went into the pot. Because in St. Mary Mead, even the most comforting dish can conceal a dangerous intention. Before we uncover what was truly stirred into that broth, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Cook's Poisoned Broth. The village of St. Mary Mead believed itself to be a peaceful place. It was the sort of village where people greeted one another by name, where doors were rarely locked during the day, and where gossip traveled faster than the Morning Post. The villagers believed danger came from outside places, from big cities filled with strangers and secrets. In St. Mary Mead, life was simple, predictable, and safe. At least, that was what people liked to believe. But danger does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carried on the steam rising from a bowl of warm broth. On a cold autumn afternoon, Hawthorne House stood silent at the edge of the village. It was a large, well-kept house built many years earlier, surrounded by old trees whose leaves had already begun to fall. The windows glowed faintly with warm light, offering comfort against the grey sky and steady drizzle outside. Inside the house, the kitchen was alive with the comforting sounds of cooking. Pots simmered gently on the stove, knives tapped against wooden boards, and the faint smell of herbs filled the air. Mrs. Edith Braxton stood at the center of it all. She had been the cook at Hawthorne House for over a decade, and she treated the kitchen as her personal kingdom. She was a tall woman with firm hands and steady eyes, the sort of person who believed that every task should be done carefully and properly. Her movements were calm and controlled as she stirred the large pot resting on the iron stove. Inside the pot, a rich chicken broth simmered slowly. The surface of the liquid shimmered under the kitchen light, small pieces of chicken floating among chopped herbs and vegetables. The smell was warm and inviting, the sort of smell that promised comfort after a long day. Mrs. Braxton dipped a spoon into the pot and lifted it carefully to her lips. She tasted the broth, paused for a moment, and then nodded with quiet satisfaction. The broth was perfect. Cooking was not simply work for Mrs. Braxton. It was precision. It was timing. It was control. Every ingredient added at the right moment created something reliable, something predictable. A meal prepared properly could bring peace to a household. Or at least, that was what most people believed. Upstairs, in the dining room, the man who owned Hawthorne House sat waiting for his evening meal. Arthur Hawthorne was not a man known for warmth. Tall and thin with sharp features and cold grey eyes, he carried the reputation of a strict and disciplined businessman. He had built his fortune through careful decisions and hard work, but those same qualities had made him distant even from those closest to him. Across the table sat his daughter, Clara Hawthorne. She was young and intelligent, with kind eyes that once held a lively curiosity about the world. In recent months, however, that curiosity had faded. Living under her father's constant control had slowly replaced her bright spirit with quiet obedience. She spoke little during dinner, partly out of respect and partly because she had learned it was easier not to challenge her father. Also seated at the table that evening was Dr. Leonard Price, the village physician. He had become a frequent guest at Hawthorne House over the past year. Officially, his visits were friendly and professional. Unofficially, the village had already begun whispering that the doctor had a special interest in Clara Hawthorne. Whether Arthur Hawthorne approved of that interest was another matter entirely. The three of them sat quietly as the clock ticked softly against the wall. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the silence as the dining room door opened. Mrs. Braxton entered carrying a large tray. Resting on the tray were 3 bowls filled with steaming broth. The rich smell drifted through the room immediately. It was simple food, but the kind that warmed the body and eased the mind after a long day. Mrs. Braxton placed the first bowl carefully in front of Arthur Hawthorne. The second bowl went to Clara, and the third to Dr. Price. Her movements were calm and practiced, the routine of years performed without hesitation. "Your dinner," she said simply before leaving the room. Arthur Hawthorne wasted no time. He lifted his spoon and dipped it into the broth. Steam curled upward as he brought the spoon to his lips and tasted it. For a moment, nothing seemed unusual. Then his expression changed. His eyebrows tightened slightly as if he had noticed something strange. His hand trembled just enough for Clara to notice. "Father," she asked quietly. Arthur opened his mouth to speak. "This tastes..." The sentence ended abruptly. His spoon slipped from his fingers and clattered against the table. His body stiffened for a moment before collapsing forward heavily, knocking the bowl aside as he fell. Clara's scream shattered the silence of the room. Dr. Price leapt from his chair, rushing to Arthur Hawthorne's side. The doctor placed 2 fingers against the man's neck, searching desperately for a pulse. His expression darkened almost immediately. "Good heavens," he whispered. Clara stood frozen beside the table, her face pale with shock. "What is it? What's happening?" Dr. Price looked at her slowly. "He's gone." Within minutes the house had erupted into chaos. Servants rushed through the halls, voices rose in confusion, and someone was sent running to fetch the police. Arthur Hawthorne, one of the wealthiest men in the village, had died suddenly at his own dinner table. By evening Inspector Grant arrived at Hawthorne House. He was a careful man with years of experience behind him, and he had learned to distrust situations that appeared simple. As he stood in the quiet kitchen examining the large cooking pot, the faint smell of herbs still lingered in the air. The broth had already been taken for testing, but the circumstances were clear enough to raise suspicion. Arthur Hawthorne had died moments after tasting it. Mrs. Braxton sat calmly at the kitchen table as the inspector questioned her. "You prepared the meal this evening?" he asked. "Yes." "You served the broth personally?" "Yes." Inspector Grant studied her carefully. "Did you add anything unusual to the pot?" "No." "Are you aware that Mr. Hawthorne died almost immediately after tasting it?" Her expression did not change. "Yes." "I heard the commotion." The inspector leaned forward slightly. "That suggests poison may have been present in the broth." Mrs. Braxton folded her hands quietly on the table. "I suppose that is possible." Her calmness unsettled him. Most people would show shock or fear when accused of something so serious. Mrs. Braxton showed neither. Upstairs, Clara Hawthorne sat wrapped in a blanket, trembling as the shock of the evening slowly settled over her. Dr. Price stood nearby, trying to reassure her while answering questions from the police. "It happened very quickly," he explained. "Too quickly for natural causes." Inspector Grant nodded slowly. "So you believe poison was involved?" "Yes." "And the broth is the only logical source?" The inspector glanced toward the kitchen. 3 bowls had been served from the same pot. Yet only one man had died. That detail troubled him more than anything else. Not far away in the village, Miss Jane Marple sat comfortably by the window of her small cottage, knitting quietly as she listened to the news delivered by her friend Mrs. Bantry. Arthur Hawthorne dead at dinner. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed breathlessly. And the cook made broth for all 3 of them. Miss Marple continued knitting calmly. Yes, I heard. Well, surely that means the cook poisoned him. Miss Marple paused for a moment before answering. My dear, she said gently, that would seem obvious, wouldn't it? Mrs. Bantry blinked. Well, yes. Miss Marple smiled faintly. But in my experience, the obvious explanation is very rarely the correct one. Outside, the mist thickened over St. Mary Mead as night settled over the quiet village. Somewhere nearby, a person believed they had committed the perfect murder. But what they did not realize was that someone in the village had already begun noticing the small details that others overlooked. And in St. Mary Mead, small details had a very dangerous habit of revealing the truth. Chapter 2: The Secret Inside the Broth. The morning after Arthur Hawthorne's sudden death arrived under a pale sky that seemed unusually quiet for the village of St. Mary Mead. Normally the village woke slowly, with the sounds of milk carts, opening shop doors, and neighbors exchanging greetings across garden fences. On this morning, however, those ordinary sounds carried an edge of curiosity and unease. Word of Arthur Hawthorne's death had already spread through every lane and cottage, and people spoke about it in hushed voices as if the mystery itself might be listening. A wealthy man collapsing at dinner was shocking enough, but the rumor that poison had been found in his food had transformed the event into something far more troubling. In a place where people believed they knew everything about their neighbors, the idea that someone in the village might be capable of murder disturbed everyone deeply. Hawthorne House itself felt very different from the orderly place it had been only a day earlier. The servants moved quietly through the hallways, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary. The large dining room remained untouched since the evening before, as if no one wished to disturb the memory of what had happened there. The long table stood exactly as it had during the fatal dinner, the chairs arranged neatly, the polished surface reflecting the pale morning light that filtered through the tall windows. It was difficult for anyone entering the room not to imagine Arthur Hawthorne sitting once again at the head of the table, lifting his spoon, tasting the broth, and suddenly collapsing without warning. Inspector Grant arrived at the house shortly after sunrise, bringing with him the quiet determination of a man who understood that the truth often revealed itself through patience rather than force. He had spent many years investigating crimes, and experience had taught him that the simplest explanations were often the most misleading. A poisoned meal prepared by the cook might seem obvious, but the inspector had already begun to suspect that the situation was not nearly so straightforward. His first stop was the kitchen, the place where the fatal broth had been prepared. The room still carried the faint smell of herbs and simmered chicken from the previous evening, though the large iron pot had already been taken away for examination. Mrs. Edith Braxton sat calmly at the wooden kitchen table with the same composed posture she had shown during the previous night's questioning. Her expression revealed nothing of what she might be thinking, and the steady way she looked at the inspector suggested that she was neither frightened nor confused by the situation. Inspector Grant took a seat across from her and removed a small notebook from his pocket. He spoke in a measured voice that carried neither accusation nor sympathy, only a quiet search for facts. He explained that he needed to review the events of the previous evening carefully and asked her to describe the preparation of the broth once again. Mrs. Braxton answered without hesitation, explaining that the dish had been made exactly as she had made it countless times before. The ingredients were simple and ordinary: chicken, vegetables, herbs, water, and salt. Nothing unusual had been added, and the cooking process had followed the same routine she had used throughout her years in the Hawthorne kitchen. She described tasting the broth herself before serving it, as any careful cook would do, and she insisted that the flavor had been perfectly normal. After pouring the broth into 3 bowls, she had carried them to the dining room and placed them in front of Mr. Hawthorne, Miss Clara, and Dr. Price. Once the bowls were served, she had left the room to prepare the next course, expecting to return a few minutes later as she always did. Instead, she heard a scream echo through the hallway and rushed back to find Arthur Hawthorne collapsed at the table. Inspector Grant listened carefully to every word. The detail about tasting the broth interested him more than anything else she had said. If poison had been present in the pot itself, the cook would almost certainly have suffered the effects as well. Yet Mrs. Braxton showed no sign of illness, and her calm confidence suggested she was certain of that fact. The inspector made a note in his book and continued asking questions, though her answers remained steady and consistent. When the interview ended, he left the kitchen with the uneasy feeling that the true explanation might be hidden somewhere beyond the obvious. Upstairs, Clara Hawthorne sat quietly in the sitting room where the curtains had been drawn back to let in the pale morning light. Her face looked tired and fragile, and the teacup resting in her hands had long since gone cold. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind again and again, each memory as vivid and painful as the moment itself. She remembered the steam rising from the bowls, the calm silence of the dinner table, and her father's sudden expression of confusion before he collapsed. A soft knock sounded at the door before it opened slowly, and Miss Jane Marple stepped inside with the gentle courtesy that had made her welcome in so many homes throughout the village. Clara seemed slightly surprised to see her but offered a quiet greeting and invited her to sit. Miss Marple took the chair near the window and studied the young woman with kind, understanding eyes. She spoke softly, expressing sympathy for the shock Clara had experienced and reassuring her that such sudden tragedies often left people feeling lost and uncertain. Gradually the conversation turned to the dinner itself. Miss Marple asked Clara to describe exactly what had happened at the table, encouraging her to recall every small detail. Clara explained that the cook had served the broth in 3 bowls and that all 3 diners had begun eating. She herself had taken only a single spoonful before noticing her father's strange reaction. Dr. Price had also started eating, though she could not remember exactly how much he had tasted before the moment of panic began. Miss Marple listened carefully, her thoughtful expression revealing that she was paying close attention to more than just the obvious facts. When Clara finished speaking, the elderly woman gently pointed out something that had begun to trouble her. If the broth itself had been poisoned in the kitchen, everyone who tasted it should have been affected. Yet Clara and Dr. Price had remained perfectly well. The implication was simple but unsettling: the poison might not have been in the pot at all. While Miss Marple quietly considered that possibility, Inspector Grant had moved on to question Dr. Leonard Price at his small medical clinic in the village. The doctor appeared exhausted from the previous night, though he maintained the calm professional manner expected of a man in his position. He confirmed that Arthur Hawthorne had seemed healthy only moments before collapsing and agreed that the speed of the death strongly suggested poison rather than illness. When asked about Mr. Hawthorne's final words, he explained that the man had begun to comment that the broth tasted unusual but had not lived long enough to explain what he meant. The inspector then asked about the relationship between the doctor and Clara Hawthorne. Dr. Price admitted openly that he cared deeply for her and hoped to marry her one day, though Arthur Hawthorne had strongly opposed the idea. According to the doctor, Mr. Hawthorne believed no man in the village was worthy of his daughter and had made his disapproval very clear. The tension created by that disagreement had been widely known among those who visited the house. Inspector Grant noted this information carefully. Motive was often an important piece of any investigation, and the possibility that someone might benefit from Arthur Hawthorne's death could not be ignored. Still, the inspector knew that motive alone was never enough to prove guilt. The real answer would have to come from understanding exactly how the poison had entered the meal. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village lanes, her mind quietly organizing the details she had heard. She believed strongly that human behavior followed certain patterns that appeared again and again in different situations. By comparing one event to another, she often found that complicated mysteries became much clearer. As she walked past gardens and hedges glistening with recent rain, she thought about the 3 bowls of broth, the cook who had tasted the pot without harm, and the 2 diners who had survived. The more she considered it, the more certain she became that the poison must have been added after the bowls were placed on the table. That simple conclusion created a new and troubling possibility. If the broth had been safe when it left the kitchen, then someone sitting at the dining table must have altered one of the bowls. And if that was true, the person responsible for Arthur Hawthorne's death had been seated only a few feet away from him when it happened. Miss Marple paused beside the gate of Hawthorne House and looked toward the windows where the events of the previous evening had taken place. Somewhere inside that quiet building was the answer to the mystery. Someone had carefully arranged a moment that looked like an unfortunate accident, believing the truth would remain hidden among the confusion. But Miss Marple understood something very important about human nature. People who believed they had committed the perfect crime often overlooked the smallest details. And in a village like St. Mary Mead, small details had a remarkable way of revealing very dangerous secrets. Chapter 3: The Bowl That Killed. 2 days after Arthur Hawthorne's death, the tension inside Hawthorne House had grown heavy and uncomfortable. The servants moved carefully through the halls as though the house itself were listening to every whisper. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead continued its quiet routines, yet everyone waited for the same question to be answered. How had Arthur Hawthorne been poisoned when 2 other people had eaten the same meal and remained perfectly unharmed? The mystery had unsettled the entire village, and even Inspector Grant had begun to realize that the solution would require more than ordinary investigation. On the afternoon of the 2nd day, the inspector made an unusual request. He asked that the key people connected to the dinner be gathered once more in the dining room where Arthur Hawthorne had died. The room had been cleaned and restored to its normal appearance, yet the memory of that terrible moment seemed to linger in the air. The large dining table stood beneath the tall windows, its polished surface reflecting the dim light of the cloudy afternoon. Clara Hawthorne entered first. She looked pale but calmer than before, though the strain of the past days remained visible in her tired eyes. Dr. Leonard Price arrived soon afterward, standing quietly near the fireplace with his arms folded. His face appeared composed, but there was a faint stiffness in his posture that suggested the pressure of the investigation had begun to affect him. Mrs. Edith Braxton, the cook, stood near the doorway. Her expression remained steady and unreadable, just as it had throughout the questioning. She showed neither fear nor anger, only a quiet patience, as though she had already accepted whatever conclusion the investigation might reach. Finally, Miss Jane Marple entered the room with her usual calm manner, taking a seat beside the window. She rested her hands neatly in her lap and looked around the room with gentle curiosity. Though she had not been formally involved in the investigation, Inspector Grant had come to value her observations more than he expected. When everyone had gathered, the inspector stepped forward. He explained that the laboratory had finished examining the remains of the broth and the dishes used during the dinner. The results had confirmed what the doctor had already suspected. Arthur Hawthorne had indeed died from a powerful poison that had entered his body moments before his collapse. Yet the laboratory had also revealed something far more important. The poison had not been evenly mixed in the broth. Only one bowl had contained it. For several seconds no one spoke. The meaning of that statement slowly settled over the room like a cold shadow. If the poison had been present only in Arthur Hawthorne's bowl, then it could not have come from the pot in the kitchen. The broth served to Clara Hawthorne and Dr. Price had been completely harmless. Inspector Grant continued explaining that the cook's claim about tasting the broth from the pot now made perfect sense. The broth itself had never been poisoned. The fatal substance must have been added later, sometime after the bowls had been placed on the dining table. Clara looked confused as she tried to understand what this meant. If the broth was safe when it came from the kitchen, she said slowly, then someone must have put the poison into Father's bowl afterward. The inspector nodded. That is exactly what must have happened. The room fell silent again as the realization grew clearer. There had been only 3 people seated at the table when the bowls were served. Arthur Hawthorne himself could not have poisoned his own meal, which left only 2 possibilities. Clara Hawthorne or Dr. Leonard Price. Miss Marple watched the 2 of them quietly for a moment before speaking in her gentle voice. She explained that the situation reminded her of many small incidents she had observed in village life. Often the truth became clearer when one asked a simple question, who had both the reason and the opportunity to act. She began with Clara Hawthorne. The young woman certainly had reason to resent her father's strict control. Arthur Hawthorne had ruled her life with firm authority, deciding her future and refusing to allow her to marry the man she loved. Yet Miss Marple also pointed out something important about Clara's character. During the dinner she had taken only one small taste of the broth before her father collapsed. If she had intended to poison him through the meal, she would have known the danger of tasting the food herself. Her reaction had been genuine shock, not the careful performance of someone expecting the result. Miss Marple then turned her calm attention toward Dr. Leonard Price. She explained that the doctor's position at the table gave him a very convenient opportunity. When the cook had left the room after serving the bowls, the 3 diners had been alone together. In such a quiet moment, it would have been easy for someone to reach toward the center of the table and appear to adjust something as ordinary as the salt or seasoning. Inspector Grant then revealed the final piece of evidence. Earlier that morning the police had tested the salt container that had been sitting on the table during the dinner. Hidden among the grains of salt was a small amount of powdered poison, nearly invisible to the eye but deadly when mixed with liquid. The inspector explained that the poison had been placed inside the salt container before dinner. During the meal, someone had tipped a small amount into Arthur Hawthorne's bowl while pretending to season the food. The action would have taken only a second, and no one would have considered it unusual. As the meaning of these words became clear, Clara slowly turned to look at Dr. Price. His calm expression had begun to fade. Miss Marple spoke softly but firmly, explaining that the doctor's motive had been painfully simple. Arthur Hawthorne had been the only obstacle standing between him and the life he wished to share with Clara. Removing that obstacle would free Clara from her father's control and allow the doctor to appear as her loyal supporter during the difficult time that followed. Dr. Price tried to defend himself at first, insisting that such an accusation was ridiculous. Yet the more he spoke, the less convincing his words sounded. The discovery of the poison in the salt container had already destroyed his position. At last his voice grew tired and bitter. He admitted that Arthur Hawthorne had been determined to separate him from Clara forever. The old man had threatened to cut his daughter off from her inheritance and send her away from the village if she continued the relationship. In the doctor's mind, the situation had seemed hopeless. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself that removing Arthur Hawthorne was the only way to secure the future he wanted. Inspector Grant stepped forward and informed him that he was under arrest for the murder of Arthur Hawthorne. The doctor did not resist. The fight had left his expression, and he allowed the inspector to place him under guard without another word. Clara sat silently in her chair as the truth settled over her. The man she had trusted and believed in had turned out to be capable of something far darker than she had ever imagined. The realization hurt more deeply than the shock of her father's sudden death. Miss Marple quietly walked toward the window and looked out across the quiet gardens of Hawthorne House. The mystery that had troubled the village was finally solved, yet the solution carried its own sadness. Human ambition and desperation had once again turned an ordinary moment into tragedy. Inspector Grant thanked Miss Marple for her insight before leaving the house to complete the arrest. As the sound of the carriage wheels faded down the road, the house slowly returned to silence. In villages like St. Mary Mead, life often appeared peaceful on the surface. Yet beneath that peaceful appearance lived the same hopes, fears, and ambitions found everywhere else in the world. Sometimes those emotions led people to choices they believed were clever or justified, forgetting that even the smallest mistake could reveal the truth. And in this case, the smallest mistake had been a pinch of poison added to a bowl of harmless broth. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery and want to discover more quiet crimes hidden in peaceful villages, be sure to subscribe and join us for the next Miss Marple mystery, where another ordinary moment may hide a very dangerous secret.